Welcome to Puzzle Proof. Join us as we unravel today's captivating story and solve exciting puzzles together. Get ready to engage your mind. Let the journey start. Miss Marple and the Ticking Enigma. Chapter 1. A Curious Invitation. It was one of those bright, crisp mornings in St. Mary Mead, when the dew still clung to the roses in Miss Marple's well-tended garden, and the birds chirping seemed to harmonize with the gentle rustle of the leaves. In her modest sitting room, with its familiar floral wallpaper and the comforting clink of her teacup against the saucer, Miss Marple was enjoying her customary morning tea when the post arrived. A single letter, sealed in cream-colored envelope and penned in an elegant, deliberate hand, rested on the doily that graced her little table. The handwriting was neat and measured, a style not unfamiliar to those who appreciated both precision and propriety. Curious, Miss Marple broke the seal with her customary quiet deliberation. The letter, addressed in formal script, began thus: "My dear Miss Marple, it is with a sense of both pleasure and trepidation that I extend to you an invitation to Larkwood Manor for a weekend gathering. I find myself confronted by a matter of some delicacy, a puzzle, if you will, that I trust your penetrating observations might help resolve. Yours sincerely, Sir Reginald Aston." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she read the final line. Sir Reginald Aston was a man of considerable standing, a distinguished owner of Larkwood Manor, known for his affability and generous patronage in local circles. Yet, beneath the courteous tone of his invitation, she sensed a faint undercurrent of unease. There was a subtle suggestion in his words, a hint that this was no ordinary social call. She set the letter down, and for a moment her mind wandered to the nuances of human nature that she had observed over many years in her quaint village. "How curious," she murmured to herself, "that a man of Sir Reginald's reputation should harbour such secret apprehensions." Her thoughts turned to the delicate interplay of appearances and hidden truths, a balance so often disturbed by life's unexpected complications. Miss Marple decided that she must accept the invitation. It was not merely the call to socialize that intrigued her, but rather the promise of unraveling a small enigma that might have grown out of the mundane fabric of village life. There was always a certain charm in puzzles, no matter how trivial they might first appear. With a polite, knowing smile, she rose from her seat and prepared for the day ahead, all the while contemplating the possibilities that lay in wait at Larkwood Manor. Later that morning, as she strolled along the familiar lane leading from her cottage, Miss Marple encountered her neighbour, Mrs. Fletcher, who was busy tending to her rose bushes. The older woman paused, wiping her hands on her apron, and inquired, "Good morning, Miss Marple. I see you're in fine spirits today. Anything to celebrate?" "Good morning, Mrs. Fletcher," replied Miss Marple, with a gentle laugh. "I have received an invitation that promises a rather interesting puzzle. It appears Sir Reginald Aston has requested my presence at his estate, Larkwood Manor, for a weekend gathering. One can only wonder what delicate matter he has in mind." Mrs. Fletcher's eyes widened in mild surprise. "Sir Reginald, you say? He's always been so courteous, though I've often thought there was more to him than met the eye. I dare say there's something peculiar about that invitation, though I cannot say what." Their conversation, light and unassuming as it was, only deepened Miss Marple's interest. "Indeed," she mused, "there is always a story behind every invitation. Often the smallest details, the choice of words, the tone, reveal more than the letter itself. I suspect that Sir Reginald's puzzle is not one of mere triviality." Returning home, Miss Marple took a quiet moment to reread the letter, her mind meticulously cataloguing every phrase. The mention of a puzzle and the reference to a matter of some delicacy resonated with her years of understanding that in every social gathering beneath the veneer of everyday pleasantries lay secrets and hidden motives. Was it a slight personal grievance, or perhaps a subtle hint at a family matter best kept in the shadows? Only time would tell. In that peaceful morning light, with her tea cooling beside the open letter, Miss Marple resolved to attend the weekend gathering at Larkwood Manor. She felt a familiar thrill, the anticipation of untangling a knot of human intricacies, a challenge that promised both intellectual stimulation and the possibility of unmasking truths that in the wrong hands might wreak havoc. Thus, with a final, contemplative glance at the letter, Miss Marple set her mind to prepare herself for what lay ahead. Little did she suspect that this seemingly innocuous invitation was the first thread in a tapestry of mystery that would soon envelop her beloved village, and indeed reveal that even the most genteel faces can conceal the darkest of secrets. Chapter 2. The Gathering at Larkwood Manor. Larkwood Manor stood in all its stately grandeur against the soft autumn light, a splendid relic of a bygone era. Its ivy-clad walls and turrets rose majestically from the manicured lawns, setting a scene of both elegance and mystery. Miss Marple arrived at the imposing wrought-iron gates with a sense of calm anticipation. Even as she admired the picturesque surroundings, a tapestry of golden leaves and gentle hedgerows, the subtle tensions of human nature were never far from her thoughts. Upon entering the manor, Miss Marple was promptly introduced to the array of colourful characters gathered for the weekend. The first to greet her was Edward Aston, the dapper yet visibly troubled nephew of the late Sir Reginald. Edward's neat attire and courteous smile were marred by an undercurrent of unease in his eyes. "Miss Marple, it is an honour to have you with us," he said, his voice steady but betraying hints of inner conflict. "Please, do make yourself at home." Not long after, Mrs. Langley appeared, a figure as much a part of the manor as its very walls. The long-serving housekeeper carried herself with an air of quiet authority, her simple bonnet and pressed skirt a testament to years of devoted service. Her warm yet measured welcome was punctuated by a look that suggested she had witnessed more than her share of secrets within these venerable halls. In a quiet corner of the entrance hall, Reverend Collins awaited with his customary gentle smile. His kindly demeanour and soft-spoken manner gave little away of the reserve of secrets he seemed to harbour. "Miss Marple, I trust your journey was pleasant," he inquired in a low, reassuring tone, his eyes reflecting both compassion and a cautious wariness. Finally, Lady Evelyn, an elegant and graceful companion of Sir Reginald, joined the group. Dressed in a tasteful gown that accentuated her refined beauty, she greeted Miss Marple with a serene, yet somewhat melancholic smile. "Your presence brings a measure of comfort to these troubled times," she confided quietly, her tone laced with an emotion that belied her composed exterior. As the afternoon yielded to evening, the assembled guests gathered in the grand dining room. The long oak table was set with pristine china and polished silver, illuminated by the soft glow of flickering candlelight. The atmosphere was congenial, if slightly formal, as conversations meandered over the familiar pleasantries of estate life. Yet beneath the veneer of decorum, Miss Marple's practiced eyes discerned subtle undercurrents of disquiet. Throughout the meal, delicate barbs and polite repartees were exchanged. Edward's forced laughter and the discreet glances shared between Lady Evelyn and Reverend Collins hinted at hidden resentments and unspoken alliances. Mrs. Langley, ever the quiet observer, moved gracefully among the guests, her serene smile occasionally giving way to a hint of guarded sadness. In the midst of these carefully measured interactions, a curious incident occurred. One of the younger guests, a rather nervous chap with an impish glimmer in his eyes, leaned back in his chair and with a light-hearted tone recited a slightly off-kilter version of a well-known nursery rhyme, "Hickory, dickory, dock, the clock did mock the ticking clock." The unexpected alteration in the rhyme caused a brief ripple of surprise around the table. A few raised eyebrows followed the recitation, and Miss Marple herself could not suppress a bemused smile. To an untrained ear, the playful verse might have appeared nothing more than youthful jest. However, Miss Marple was long aware that even the simplest of words might conceal a hint of something far more significant. "An amusing turn of phrase, wouldn't you say?" remarked Reverend Collins softly, his tone mingling amusement with a trace of inquiry. His remark drew a short, thoughtful pause from those present, as if everyone, for a fleeting moment, had sensed that the rhyme might have been more than mere banter. Edward, his gaze momentarily clouded with a flicker of distress, offered a tight smile. Lady Evelyn's hand, resting lightly on the table, trembled ever so slightly before she composed herself. Mrs. Langley's expression remained impassive, yet her eyes seemed to narrow in quiet contemplation. Miss Marple, meanwhile, carefully catalogued these reactions in her mind. She knew well that in such refined gatherings, the subtlest gesture, a tightening of a smile, a fleeting look, could reveal volumes about a person's true feelings. It was precisely these nuances that formed the essence of her investigations. As the dinner drew to a close, the guests dispersed into the manor's cosy drawing room for coffee and further conversation. The murmur of voices, the soft clink of porcelain, and the gentle rustling of silks created an atmosphere both inviting and enigmatic. Miss Marple settled into a comfortable armchair near the fire, her thoughts as lively as the flames that danced in the hearth. She reflected upon the evening's events, already piecing together the minor clues, the troubled eyes of Edward, the barely concealed tension in Lady Evelyn's voice, and the strange recitation of a nursery rhyme that promised to be the first threads in what would surely become a tangled web of mystery. Chapter 3. The Mysterious Death. The pleasant hum of conversation and laughter that had enlivened Larkwood Manor the previous evening was abruptly silenced by a grim discovery the following morning. A crisp dawn had barely broken when the household was roused by hushed whispers and furtive glances. In the once serene study of Sir Reginald Aston, a room known for its quiet reflection and scholarly calm, a scene of unsettling stillness now reigned. Miss Marple, who had retired early after a long dinner, was the first to sense that something was amiss. As she strolled down the corridor, the familiar clatter of footsteps was replaced by an eerie quiet. The door to the study, slightly ajar, beckoned her with an inexplicable foreboding. With measured steps she entered, her keen eyes immediately noting the details that others might miss. The study, a room lined with dark mahogany bookshelves and adorned with portraits of long-departed ancestors, now bore the unmistakable aura of a crime scene. At the center of the polished oak desk lay a half-finished cup of tea. The porcelain was exquisitely delicate, yet the tea within bore an unusual hue, a tint that suggested its contents had been tampered with. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the antique clock that hung above the desk. Its steady ticking had ceased abruptly at 8:15, as if marking the very moment when life had departed from Sir Reginald. Yet it was a small scrap of paper carelessly left on the desk's edge that captured her attention most. Scribbled in a hurried, almost playful scrawl were the words, "Hickory, dickory, dock." The familiar nursery rhyme, now stripped of its innocent cadence, seemed an odd, even mocking postscript to the scene of death. For a moment Miss Marple pondered the significance of the rhyme, a clue perhaps deliberately planted or a misdirect meant to confuse. The house was soon abuzz with activity. Mrs. Langley, the indefatigable housekeeper, bustled in with her customary efficiency, her face a mask of stoic concern as she attempted to comfort the others. Edward Aston, the dapper yet troubled nephew, stood by the doorway, his features drawn and pale. Reverend Collins arrived next, his gentle demeanour betraying an inner turmoil as he murmured prayers under his breath for the departed soul of his friend. Lady Evelyn, whose elegant composure now appeared fragile, clutched her shawl tightly as she surveyed the room with tearful eyes. Amid the flurry, the local constable began his preliminary enquiries. He asked timid questions and jotted down notes with a furrowed brow, clearly overwhelmed by the weight of the unfolding mystery. Yet while the authorities focused on collecting overt evidence, Miss Marple quietly began her own investigation, guided by a seasoned intuition honed over years of observing the subtleties of human nature. Seated in an armchair near a window that framed the dew-laden garden, she reviewed every detail in her mind. "It is never the obvious that betrays the truth," she murmured softly. Her thoughts lingered on the altered tea, the clock's cessation at precisely 8:15, and the enigmatic scrap of paper. The rhyme, though seemingly trivial, resonated with a curious familiarity, a thread linking the events of the previous evening with this tragic outcome. Had Sir Reginald's mysterious invitation and the playful recitation at dinner foreshadowed this moment, or was it an elaborate ruse by someone with darker intentions? In a hushed conversation with Mrs. Langley later that morning, Miss Marple delicately broached the subject. "Mrs. Langley, dear, do you recall any unusual occurrence last night, or any remark that might have hinted at trouble?" The housekeeper, her eyes momentarily betraying a flicker of uncertainty, replied, "Miss Marple, I cannot say for sure. Sir Reginald was his kind, gentle self until the very end. Yet there were whispers among the staff, small murmurs that perhaps not all was as it seemed." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her gaze drifting once more to the study. "And what of that note?" she inquired softly. "Hickory? Dickory, Doc. It seems so out of place in a room where order usually prevails." Mrs. Langley hesitated, then admitted in a low voice, "There were rumours that the rhyme had been mentioned at dinner, a sort of nervous jest, perhaps, but never did I suspect it would be connected with such sorrow." Elsewhere in the manor, Edward's troubled glance and Reverend Collins' distracted silence provided additional, albeit subtle, pieces of the puzzle. The fragile calm of Larkwood Manor had been shattered, leaving in its wake an intricate tapestry of clues that, if carefully interpreted, might unravel the mystery of Sir Reginald's untimely death. As the day unfolded while the constable continued his formal inquiries, Miss Marple remained quietly vigilant. She observed the furtive exchanges of glances, noted the slight tremor in a hand, and listened intently to the overlapping whispers of guilt and grief. Every gesture and every word became a clue, a silent testament to the hidden truths that lay beneath the polished surfaces of country life. In the stillness of that tragic morning, Miss Marple's mind worked methodically, piecing together the seemingly disparate details: a poisoned cup of tea, a stopped clock, and a cryptic rhyme that echoed like a sinister refrain. Though the resolution remained hidden, she was determined to uncover the secrets that threatened to unravel the genteel facade of Larkwood Manor, and perhaps of human nature itself. Chapter 4. Scrutiny and Subtle Clues. Miss Marple entered the study with her customary calm and measured pace, her eyes taking in every detail as though they were pieces of an intricate puzzle. The room, still heavy with the shadow of recent tragedy, now presented itself as a silent archive of clues waiting to be deciphered. The polished oak desk, once the centre of Sir Reginald's reflective hours, now held evidence that spoke volumes to those who knew how to listen. Her attention was immediately drawn to a half-finished cup of tea resting precariously near the centre of the desk. Unlike the usual careful arrangement one would expect in such a dignified room, the cup was set askew, as if hastily abandoned. A closer inspection revealed a slight trace of an unusual substance clinging around its rim, something that did not belong in a perfectly normal cup of tea. Miss Marple's lips curved into a knowing smile as she mused quietly to herself. If one is to leave a poetic clue, one might choose a rhyme, but a murderer ought to be far more inventive. The antique clock, prominently displayed on the wall behind the desk, now commanded her gaze. Its delicate hands had frozen at precisely 8:15, an occurrence as curious as it was telling. She recalled that the clock was a prized family heirloom, seldom seen working by any but a few of the manor's most trusted custodians. Its cessation now seemed less an accident of time and more a deliberate marker of the final moment, a silent testimony to the precise orchestration of this grim event. Kneeling beside the desk, Miss Marple delicately examined the scrap of paper that lay nearby. Scribbled in a hurried hand were the words, "Hickory Dickory Dock." The nursery rhyme, once a simple and innocent verse, now struck her as an act of deliberate misdirection. It was as though the perpetrator had taken a familiar quip and imbued it with sinister significance. Was this a taunt directed at those who prided themselves on unraveling mysteries, or a calculated attempt to divert attention from the more damning evidence? Such questions swirled in her mind as she continued her careful inspection. Just then, Mrs. Langley appeared in the doorway. Her presence, ever steady and reassuring, brought a sense of order to the otherwise disarrayed room. "Miss Marple," she said in a quiet, respectful tone, "I hope I am not intruding. I thought you might require assistance with these delicate matters." Mrs. Langley's eyes, however, betrayed a deeper understanding of the hidden currents running through the manor's troubled soul. "Not at all, Mrs. Langley," replied Miss Marple softly, rising to meet her gaze. "It is often in the minutiae that the truth reveals itself." "Tell me, have you ever seen this clock working properly?" she asked, nodding towards the antique timepiece. Mrs. Langley hesitated only for a moment before responding. "I believe it has been in disrepair for many years, Miss Marple, a relic of a past era when Sir Reginald's family was at its most splendid. Only a select few have ever taken the trouble to see it in full working order." This revelation, though subtle, added another layer to the mystery. The clock's cessation at 8:15 might not be a mere happenstance, but a calculated signal, a final note in a macabre symphony. Miss Marple's mind whirled with possibilities as she carefully examined the rim of the teacup once more. The substance, though faint, hinted at the presence of a poison that was as exotic as it was insidious. Had the culprit deliberately laced Sir Reginald's tea to ensure a quiet, almost poetic exit from this world? As she pondered these clues, Reverend Collins entered the study, his gentle voice carrying a trace of sorrow. "Miss Marple, I cannot help but feel that every object in this room holds a secret, as if each item has been placed with a purpose beyond mere decorum." His remark, while couched in the language of grief, resonated with Miss Marple's own suspicions. "Indeed, Reverend," she agreed softly, "for in the world of human nature, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. Even a harmless nursery rhyme can be a cipher for a deeper intent." She paused, carefully considering the evidence before her. "This note, for instance, seems to be a deliberate misdirection, a mask, if you will, to hide a more troubling truth." With each observation, the quiet determination in Miss Marple's eyes grew. She was not one to be easily fooled by appearances. The subtle interplay of evidence, the unusual substance on the teacup, the stopped clock, and that seemingly innocuous note, combined to form a tapestry of clues that hinted at both premeditation and cold calculation. As she stood in the somber silence of the study, Miss Marple resolved that every small detail would be accounted for. In this delicate dance between truth and deception, even the most poetic of clues could serve as the key to unraveling a most perplexing mystery. With her mind as sharp as ever, she prepared to follow the trail of subtle clues, certain that in time the truth behind Sir Reginald's untimely demise would be brought to light. Chapter 5. A Web of Suspicions. In the days that followed the grim discovery in Sir Reginald's study, Larkwood Manor seemed to wear a shroud of unease as palpable as the morning mist over the estate's grounds. Miss Marple, ever the observant guest, found herself immersed in a labyrinth of hidden tensions and unspoken grudges. Each conversation, every subtle gesture, seemed to whisper secrets of past wrongs and present discontent. Edward Aston, Sir Reginald's dapper but troubled nephew, emerged early in Miss Marple's quiet investigations as a figure of considerable interest. His financial disputes with his late uncle had long been a topic of hushed discussion among the household. One afternoon, as Miss Marple passed the drawing room, she overheard him in a low, heated conversation with a visiting solicitor. His voice, though measured, betrayed a simmering anger when he said, "The man was too old-fashioned to understand modern commerce. I merely wanted my fair share, but his stubborn pride cost him dearly." The remark, though cloaked in polite language, left Miss Marple with the unmistakable impression that Edward's frustration went deeper than mere monetary grievances. His restless glances, darting from shadow to shadow as if expecting an unseen adversary, spoke volumes of his inner turmoil. Meanwhile, Reverend Collins, who had always been known for his gentle, pious manner, revealed a complexity that belied his calm exterior. Over tea in the Manor's cosy kitchen, the Reverend confided to one of the servants, quite out of the ordinary for a man of his station, that he had been haunted by sleepless nights since Sir Reginald's passing. "It is as though a dark cloud has settled over my spirit," he murmured, his eyes distant and troubled. When Miss Marple later gently inquired about his thoughts on the matter, he hesitated, his brow furrowing. His reticence, coupled with the subtle tremor in his voice, suggested that his sorrow might mask secrets that reached far beyond grief. Yet it was Mrs. Langley who perhaps held the Manor's most enigmatic clues. As the long-serving housekeeper, she had seen every corner of Larkwood Manor and was privy to its most intimate secrets. Her reserved nature and meticulous manner of work hid an intensity that few had ever noticed. Miss Marple observed her discreet glances exchanged with certain staff members and noted the way her eyes, often cast downward in dutiful deference, would occasionally flash with a deep, unspoken sorrow. One rainy afternoon, as the wind rattled the ancient window panes, Mrs. Langley confided in Miss Marple while they tidied the entrance hall. "I have served this family for so many years, dear, that I know each creak of these floors and every whispered argument in the corridors. Sometimes I wonder if I might be more than just a servant in these troubled times." Though her words were measured, they hinted at long-held grudges and secrets that lay buried beneath her quiet exterior. Every character in the manor seemed to be a thread in a tangled web of suspicions. A misplaced glove discovered in a narrow corridor, a hushed quarrel overheard in the twilight hours, and the furtive glances exchanged between individuals all served as red herrings in a mystery that deepened with every passing day. Miss Marple, with her soft-spoken charm and incisive mind, listened intently to each story. In one instance, and while sharing a quiet moment by the fireside, she remarked to Reverend Collins, "Sometimes the smallest detail, a glove left behind or a half-finished sentence, can unravel the most intricate tapestry of deceit." His only reply was a pensive nod, as if he, too, sensed that not all was as it appeared at Larkwood Manor. In the drawing room, the atmosphere was equally charged. Conversations that began innocuously would abruptly fall silent whenever a particular name was mentioned or a specific memory recalled. The subtle tension in Edward Aston's voice when his uncle's name was uttered, the brief but telling look exchanged between Lady Evelyn and Reverend Collins, and even Mrs. Langley's occasional sigh as she passed by the portrait gallery, all were clues that the manor held secrets beyond the visible. Miss Marple's method was as simple as it was effective. She did not rely on dramatic interrogations or overt confrontations. Instead, she allowed the natural course of conversation and the unguarded moments of human behavior to reveal the truth. Each inconsistency, each unaccounted for detail was carefully noted and stored away in her quiet, brilliant mind. In her gentle, almost conversational tone, she would later confide to herself, "The truth, like the subtle drift of a cloud, is often hidden in the gaps between what is said and what is left unsaid." As the investigation advanced, the manor became a stage where every whispered word and every concealed glance contributed to a growing tapestry of suspicion. Miss Marple remained steadfast, her observations guiding her toward an understanding that the resolution lay not in the obvious but in the delicate interplay of human nature. And so, with a soft smile and a determined gleam in her eye, she continued to untangle the threads of secrets that bound the inhabitants of Larkwood Manor, knowing that only by following these subtle clues would the full story come to light. Chapter 6. The Mask of Normality. In the days following Sir Reginald's tragic demise, Larkwood Manor gradually resumed its daily routines, though the echoes of recent events lingered like an unspoken secret in every corner. The household, outwardly bound by propriety and tradition, carried an undercurrent of apprehension beneath its well-polished surface. Breakfasts were served in the grand dining hall, the clink of silverware on fine china, a familiar, comforting sound. Yet to those who looked closely, the routine was marred by furtive glances and hushed conversations that betrayed the lingering tension. Miss Marple, ever the silent observer, found herself irresistibly drawn back to the study, the very room that had borne witness to the unfolding tragedy. With measured steps and an attentive gaze, she revisited the scene. The study was bathed in soft morning light that streamed through tall, leaded windows, illuminating the dust motes that swirled in the still air. On the polished oak desk rested the half-finished cup of tea, its rim marked by a faint residue of an unfamiliar substance. Above it, the antique clock, a cherished heirloom of the Aston family, stood frozen at precisely 8:15. Its sudden and deliberate silence was, to Miss Marple's keen mind, a silent marker of the exact moment when fate had intervened. Lying near the cup was the curious scrap of paper bearing the inscription "Hickory Dickory Dock." Unlike the chaotic scrawl one might expect in a moment of panic, the writing was neat, deliberate, and precise. "A clue, perhaps?" Miss Marple mused quietly, running her finger along the edges of the paper. "One that has been crafted with care, as though by someone who knows the value of precision." Such neatness suggested that the note was no spur-of-the-moment outburst of fear. It was the calculated act of a person intent on both revealing and concealing the truth. As the household carried on with its daily affairs, Miss Marple continued her subtle probing. In the quiet hours of an overcast afternoon, while the rest of the manor's inhabitants busied themselves with their customary duties, she pored over a leather-bound diary she had discovered hidden among Sir Reginald's papers. The diary, a relic of personal recollections, contained an entry that piqued her interest. It mentioned a long-forgotten nursery rhyme, a variant of "Hickory Dickory Dock," recited on several occasions by a member of the staff. The entry hinted that this was no mere childish ditty, but a habitual utterance of the young maid, Miss Beatrice, during moments of nervous tension. Miss Marple's mind turned over the significance of this detail. Could it be that the seemingly innocuous rhyme, repurposed in the form of a neatly penned note, was meant to mislead? Appearances, as we know, are designed to mislead, she murmured softly to herself. What seems trivial may in fact be the very clue upon which the entire case hinges. The deliberate neatness of the note now appeared less an oddity and more a calculated gesture, an attempt to obscure the truth behind a facade of normality. Later that day, Miss Marple found a moment to converse with Mrs. Langley in the manor's modest sitting room. The soft afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, casting gentle patterns on the rug. With her usual calm and unassuming manner, Mrs. Langley confessed, "Miss Marple, I have often thought that this manor, for all its stately charm, harbours secrets in the very dust of its halls. There is a quiet habit among the staff, a little rhyme recited in times of nervousness. I believe young Miss Beatrice is the one who often utters it, though she dismisses it as a childish relic of her past." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet understanding. "Indeed, Mrs. Langley," she replied. "It is remarkable how something so simple can be repurposed as a clue. A seemingly innocent rhyme, written with such deliberate care, might well be a cipher, an invitation to look beyond the surface and discover the hidden truths beneath." Her words, though soft, carried the weight of her convictions, and Mrs. Langley nodded in silent agreement. As the days wore on, the semblance of normality persisted, yet every conversation, every slight movement in the corridors of Larkwood Manor seemed imbued with an air of guarded restraint. Servants moved quietly through the halls, and the residents maintained their genteel routines with an effort that belied the undercurrent of fear and suspicion that now gripped the household. In quiet moments, while strolling the manicured gardens or sitting by the flickering fire in the drawing room, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate interplay of human nature and deception. "It is often in the ordinary that the extraordinary hides," she whispered to herself. Every careful detail, the halted clock, the deliberate note, the obscure diary entry, was a thread in a vast tapestry of misdirection, one that only a patient and observant mind could hope to unravel. And so, beneath the calm mask of normality, Miss Marple resolved to continue her gentle, yet determined, inquiry. For in the careful examination of even the smallest clue lay the promise of unmasking the truth, hidden deep within the shadows of Larkwood Manor. Chapter 7. Unraveling the Tapestry. One crisp afternoon, as golden light filtered through the leaded windows of Larkwood Manor's snug drawing-room, Miss Marple gathered the remaining guests and staff. The atmosphere was one of restrained tension. Though the household had resumed its daily routines, an unspoken wariness lingered beneath the surface. The drawing-room, with its overstuffed armchairs, polished wood panels, and a modest fire crackling in the grate, seemed at once both inviting and confining, a stage set for revelations. Miss Marple, in her customary soft yet resolute manner, began to speak. "My dear friends, we have all been profoundly affected by the events of that dreadful night. It is now time to reflect on what we have seen and heard, and to consider the little details that, though seemingly trivial, may unravel the tapestry of deception woven among us." Her gaze swept the room, resting on Edward Aston, whose troubled eyes betrayed inner conflict, on Reverend Collins, whose pious exterior now appeared shadowed by secret sorrow, on Lady Evelyn, graceful yet visibly perturbed, and on Mrs. Langley, the ever-watchful housekeeper, whose quiet demeanour belied a depth of knowledge. Even the quieter staff members seemed to shrink slightly, their nervous glances betraying concealed apprehension. Miss Marple continued, "Let us consider the evidence piece by piece. In Sir Reginald's study we found a cup of tea unfinished and strangely altered. Its rim bore a residue that suggested the presence of a substance not ordinarily found in such a brew, and above it the antique clock, that cherished heirloom, had ceased its steady ticking at precisely 8:15. It is as if time itself was marked, deliberately frozen at that fatal moment." A murmur of acknowledgement passed through the room. Edward, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, ventured, "I did notice that the clock had stopped. Quite odd indeed. But perhaps it was merely a mechanical fault, nothing more." Miss Marple offered a gentle smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Sometimes a mechanical fault may be no mere accident at all, Mr. Aston. Consider, too, the curious note found near the tea, a scrap of paper on which were inscribed the words, 'Hickory, Dickory, Dock.'" She paused for effect, letting the significance of those familiar words settle among the listeners. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, not the hurried scrawl of panic, but that of someone accustomed to precision. Such carefulness cannot be the work of a frantic hand, but rather a calculated act. Reverend Collins, his voice soft and reflective, remarked, "I remember hearing that very rhyme whispered among the servants on several occasions, a little utterance by young Miss Beatrice when she was nervous. It always struck me as somewhat out of place in such a dignified setting." His words, though spoken in gentle tones, added another layer to the growing intrigue. Lady Evelyn, clasping her hands tightly, added, "There were also moments last night when conversations faltered, when a remark was made in passing that seemed to carry more than mere idle chatter. One could not help but notice that everyone here appears to be concealing something." Her eyes darted briefly towards Mrs. Langley, who, maintaining her poised exterior, offered a slight, knowing nod. "Exactly," Miss Marple interjected softly. "Each of these minor inconsistencies, the altered tea, the halted clock, and the deliberate insertion of what might appear a childish nursery rhyme, chipped away at the facade of normality we have been so careful to maintain. The murderer, it seems, did not rely on grand gestures or obvious displays of malice. Instead, he or she exploited the predictable routines and overlooked details of daily life." A tense silence fell over the room as the assembled company exchanged nervous glances and furtive looks. Miss Marple's voice, gentle but unyielding, continued, "I have spent these past days quietly revisiting every corner of this manor, re-examining the evidence and listening closely to each of your recollections. And though many of you have provided valuable insights, there remain gaps, tiny, seemingly inconsequential details that do not quite fit the picture we have been presented." Mr. Aston shifted in his seat, his brow furrowing as he considered her words. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting that one of us is not who we appear to be? That perhaps our routines, our daily habits have been manipulated to hide a darker truth?" Miss Marple regarded him with a calm, measured look. "Not exactly, Mr. Aston. Rather, I believe that the truth lies not in the obvious, but in the subtle interplay of our actions and our silences. It is in the misplacement of a comment, the evasion of a question, or the slight tremor in a hand that the clues are hidden. The murderer has relied on our very assumptions about normality to deflect suspicion." Reverend Collins, with a heavy sigh, observed, "We all strive to maintain appearances to keep up with the routines that define us, but it is precisely these routines that can mask the extraordinary secrets we harbor." His soft words resonated in the quiet room. Miss Marple concluded, "For now I must admit that the final picture remains frustratingly incomplete. Yet I am certain that by piecing together these disparate threads, the stopped clock, the altered tea, the deliberate rhyme, we will eventually unravel this tangled tapestry. Until then, I urge all of you to be mindful of every word and gesture, for even the most innocuous detail may reveal the truth. As the conversation subsided, the guests sat in reflective silence. The room, once filled with the polite clamour of routine, now hummed with a subdued intensity. Though the mystery was far from solved, Miss Marple's careful observations had set in motion a process of unmasking the hidden layers beneath the veneer of normality, a process that in due time would expose the murderer lurking among them. Chapter 8. The Final Revelation. In the waning light of that fraught weekend, the drawing-room of Larkwood Manor assumed an almost somnolent quiet, a deceptive calm that belied the storm of emotions swirling within its occupants. The fire in the grate crackled softly against the murmurs of hushed conversation, while the heavy velvet drapes and the rich polished wood panels lent the room an air of stately serenity. It was here, in this snug and familiar setting, that Miss Marple had gathered the remaining guests and staff for the final sitting, a meeting destined to unmask the truth behind Sir Reginald's untimely death. Miss Marple, standing in the centre of the room with her customary gentle authority, surveyed the assembled figures: Edward Aston, whose troubled eyes betrayed a tumult of inner conflict; Reverend Collins, his kind face lined with sorrow and quiet secrets; Lady Evelyn, her graceful countenance now marred by a visible strain; and Mrs. Langley, the unassuming housekeeper, whose calm exterior had concealed more than anyone had suspected. Even the quieter servants, their expressions sombre, formed a silent audience to the revelations that were about to unfold. Clearing her throat softly, Miss Marple began in a measured tone. "My dear friends, we have all been deeply affected by the tragic loss of Sir Reginald, and it is now incumbent upon us to consider the evidence that has come to light over these past few days." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room as if to ensure that every pair of eyes was fixed upon her. It is clear that Sir Reginald's death was not the result of a mere accident of nature. Every detail, the broken clock that stopped at precisely 8:15, the altered contents of his tea, and even the curious note inscribed with the words "Hickory, Dickory, Dock," was arranged, it seems, to mislead us. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Edward shifted in his chair, his jaw set in a manner that suggested suppressed frustration, while Reverend Collins looked downcast, his hands clasped tightly together. Lady Evelyn's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and even Mrs. Langley's usually impassive expression now appeared to betray a hidden turmoil. Miss Marple continued, her voice unwavering. "I have scrutinized every stray clue and listened carefully to every word that has been uttered these past few days, and now, I must say, it becomes evident that our obvious suspects, the ones with open grievances or well-known quarrels, could not have orchestrated such a meticulously designed plot. The murderer, it seems, exploited the very routines and predictable habits of our daily lives." There was a pregnant pause as the assembled company exchanged tentative glances. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly as she gathered her final thoughts. "I have come to the conclusion," she said softly yet firmly, "that the true culprit is someone who has been with Sir Reginald all along, someone whose presence was so unassuming that she was entirely underestimated." At that, all eyes turned towards Mrs. Langley. The housekeeper's calm demeanour faltered for but a moment, her usually steady gaze wavering as the weight of Miss Marple's words settled over her. With a quiet, almost imperceptible tremor, Mrs. Langley lowered her eyes as if in reluctant acknowledgement of a hidden truth. Miss Marple pressed on. "For many years Mrs. Langley has served this family with unwavering loyalty and discretion, Yet, I have discovered that she was in fact much more intimately connected to Sir Reginald than any of us ever imagined. She was his unacknowledged daughter, a secret kept to preserve the delicate reputation of this family. A hush fell over the room as the implications of her words sunk in. She elaborated, her tone softening. When Sir Reginald resolved to reveal the truth of their relationship, he set in motion events that threatened to upend the established order. In that moment, Mrs. Langley saw not only the revelation of her identity, but the disappearance of the future she had long yearned for, a future of dignity and rightful recognition. In a moment of despair, she administered a rare poison into his tea, and in her haste to conceal her guilt, she left behind that mocking nursery rhyme, "Hickory dickory dock," a bitter reminder of a childhood denied. A hushed murmur rippled through the room, the tension almost palpable as Mrs. Langley's face, now pale and stricken, revealed a deep inner conflict. The other guests looked on in stunned silence, each processing the truth in their own way. As the finality of Miss Marple's revelation took hold, the local constable stepped forward to take Mrs. Langley into custody. With measured steps and a heavy heart, she was led away, leaving behind a room filled with regret and disquiet. In that final moment, as the tumult of emotions subsided into a reflective quiet, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, rueful smile. Alone later that evening, as she sat in her modest kitchen, sipping a freshly brewed cup of tea, the soft echo of the rhyme, "Hickory dickory dock," drifted through her thoughts, a gentle, lingering reminder that even the simplest of words can unlock the most complicated of puzzles.